Shyam Sundar. Shyam has many connections to this school. Started off with taking Dan Wright's content analysis seminar back in the day, more than 20 years ago at Alabama. Currently a seminar which Rhonda referred to as this content analysis. So Shyam has many connections to the school. He's co-authored with Dan Wright, co-authored with Rhonda Gibson. But he's pretty much known as probably one of the preeminent names in our field, in fact goes across our field in terms of looking at psychological issues related to communication technology. So Shyam has been on the forefront of both great theory as well as some fantastic methodology, and he's really carved a niche for himself as one of the premier scientists in the world in this area. So not surprisingly, his work is cited by many different scholars in so many different disciplines. Just a while ago, where's Seth? Yeah. So Seth's book, Seth was just pointing out his new book, which many of you know, on e-health, was sort of plug Seth's book. So might have known. It's
citation.
So he was just pointing out that Shyam is probably the most cited author in that book. So again, we're talking about someone whose influence has truly stretched beyond the star field. Try the title of today's talk, for example, indicates that Shyam is just on his way here to Chapel Hill from Madison. So he was in Madison the last couple of days talking to the folks at Seeker there. And so we thought this would be like a good subject, given that so many of us have so many very interests here to talk about some issues related to e-health. So Shyam is pretty much published in just about every journal in the field. He serves pretty much on all the editorial boards. And of late, what's really most interesting is how he's tried to take some of the work that he's been probably the pioneer in terms of interactivity, navigability, and agency and modality. So he's taking this and trying to put this within the rubric of a conceptual model called the main model. It's a great anagram as well. So the main model here stands for modality, agency, interactivity, and navigability. And so this is really some super theorizing as well. Most of you read Shyam's work also know that he is just such a lucid writer. So that's another thing which also adds some luster to his caliber as a scholar. He's been heavily funded as well. So he's been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Macarthur Foundation, and I hear that in Korea they probably have built a temple to him. So with all that said, welcome.
Thank you, Sri. Thanks for a great introduction. And as you all know, Sri is fantastic. And he is my first advisee, so I'm so proud of that as well. You should be very happy to have him. I'd like to talk today about motivational technologies. It's a kind of evolving model in my work based on a number of different models and theories that I have proposed in the past. And it's a combination of those theoretical ideas with some empirical data that have emerged in the last few years, specifically in the context of health communication, using technology in the context of health communication. So my goal for today is to kind of introduce to you the basic argument of the model, but also along the way kind of introduce you to some of the research that has informed the model, and maybe give you a taste of some of the theoretical models that preceded this one. And if you're interested further, we can have a discussion about those specific models and studies, as also pursue future avenues of research in those areas. So this model essentially has to do with kind of the explosion of technological tools that we have for health. Now, as you know now, there's been a proliferation of websites and online tools for managing our health, from preventive health to health management, disease management, and so on and so forth. There's tons of websites, tons of services available. Now, of course, there are lots of mobile apps. The last count was over 7,000 mobile apps just dedicated to managing preventive health and how to kind of keep up with your diet or with your exercise and things like that. And so there's this interest, there's this growth in technology, and in some ways the technology has kind of preceded the interest. The real data, when you look at how people actually make use of these, is not so encouraging. In general, the information seeking is rather sporadic. People don't seek health information in a systematic way. And many of these tools do not survive long beyond the novelty effect. There's no sustained use of these tools. And furthermore, as we all know from data, majority of Americans do not have healthy lifestyles. Some of the basic requirements that the Surgeon General has in terms of the minutes per day of activity, for example, are still not being met by over 60% of the population. So this is where we have a problem. And the typical approach that communication scientists have is what you see on my side here, which is go on, do an information campaign where you're didactic, you're telling people how to manage their health. And that's been the traditional approach of a lot of communication scientists in the past. Increasingly, though, they are kind of waking up to the role of interactive media. In fact, that's what I was speaking to the Seeker group at Wisconsin yesterday. And so the idea here is that there are lots of these interactive tools where it doesn't have to be you lecturing to the public, but indeed engaging them. And so we need some good theoretical models and ways of thinking about how to do that. So at the heart of this is this notion of persuasion, right? We are engaged in an activity of persuasion, and we need to make sure that there is persuasion through different means that happens. And already I'm happy to report that we've done in my lab group a content analysis of a lot of these apps. We find that these apps kind of hit on some of the big goals of persuasion. They make you personally aware of your situation. A lot of the apps are about how much you're exercising or how much your calorie intake is, tracking your temptation for if you're trying to quit smoking. So a lot of personal awareness tools. There are lots of nice tools for social influence, which is basically you get some points for being good about your diet, and then you kind of share that with others. And it's a little bit of a gamification kind of thing that you see that's going on. And a few others also use embodied agents, like avatars and coaches. Those, in my experience, are terrible. Those avatars, I mean, the coaches, where they try to, the health coach, they don't usually, after the initial kind of fascination, they tend to disappoint. I don't know if your experience is similar or different. But in general, these are the kinds of persuasive tools that you see with these modern applications. And in terms of design, we have real-time feedback. Most of these give you some feedback, but there's this need for real-time feedback. That's a big design goal. And in human-computer interaction research, a world where I have one foot in, we find that a lot of these tools kind of fall short on that. They don't do a good job of giving you real-time feedback or tailored feedback. Like the coach, for example, one of the frustrating things is you get generic kind of advice from the coach. You don't get something specific toward. And then almost all of them have serious usability issues. They're clunky. They're not quite usable in the way that we would want for a kind of a health-related activity. So there are significant design challenges involved in these. So just because we have all these tools doesn't mean that we are well on our way to a healthy society. So we need to first of all build systematic knowledge about these things, about how to kind of look at these tools first of all. So we need some evaluation metrics. We need to know whether these tools are good solutions for some of the challenges we face in terms of public health. And then furthermore, how to make people continue to use those tools. That's another challenge that we have, because it's not enough to just have these tools that are novel. People kind of adopted widely the Siri, for example, with iPhone 4S, but then quickly lost interest, right? And so like that, there are a lot of tools that you become fascinated with, but then don't sustain its use. And then another big challenge, of course, is to convert this from just online use of the tool to actual offline behavior, health behavior, because that's really the translation that needs to take place in order for this to make any difference to kind of public health, right? So these are some kind of early thoughts for us in terms of how we would design something. These are some challenges. And so the areas that my lab group has been looking at is, what are some interface characteristics? What are some characteristics of these tools? And what are some affordances? Affordances is this kind of perceptual psychological notion from Gibson, the notion that these objects afford certain actions. So action possibilities, if you will, would be a loose way of thinking about affordances. So what are some action possibilities that they permit, for example? And how do we get users to get engaged with these tools? And how can we use these tools to more effectively manage our health? So we want guidelines for designing psychological meaningful interfaces. And so the effort kind of led to this model called Motivational Technologies model, which I presented earlier this year in Sweden at the Persuasive 2012 conference. So basically, the effort here is to design technologies to enhance intrinsic motivation. That's what we mean when we say motivational technologies. So the goal here is to make people motivated to kind of use it in a sustained way and then translate that into health behaviors. So I'll give you the basic idea behind this and then kind of try to work our way through this model. So in general, when we think about technologies, especially intrinsic motivation, we need to think in terms of persuasive approaches that start with design, and then there is the notion of intentionality. So machines themselves don't have intentions, but the intentionality lies in the design. So in persuasive literature, in persuasive technology literature, we talk about the designer putting the intention into the system, so to speak. And so that's a key aspect of thinking about persuasive technology. So we have to kind of embed these systems with intentionality. And we know, of course, human agents have intention. The users have intention. But the machines themselves don't. But we need to design it such that they can communicate or derive from users the intentionality. And that's where we want to hit on the particular aspect that we want to hit on here is the notion of motivation. That is, the users need to feel motivated to pursue a particular health activity and in the first place to pursue engagement with a particular tool. So self-determination theory that some of you might have come across in psychology talks about there being two broad kinds of regulation. There's the autonomous regulation. We ourselves regulate our behavior out of our own free will. And then there's control regulation. That is, we are forced to do it, forced to kind of control certain things about our behavior. So we might study for an exam because we like the subject. That is more autonomous. We might study for an exam because the teacher threatens us with a bad grade. That would be more control kind of regulation kind of thing. So these are often termed as intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation that some of you might be familiar with. And extrinsic motivators are things from the outside, and I think we have a pretty good corpus of knowledge speaking to that. Intrinsic is something that comes from within, and that's usually more challenging because you have to change people's motivation, and many people would even argue that it's not something that you can change. And so that's really where we are going with this particular model, with this particular kind of suite of technologies, is to try and change somebody's intrinsic motivation to healthy behaviors. So in terms of intrinsic motivation, we are talking about self-determination, the ability to determine by yourself, self-regulation, you're regulating your own behavior, and we are talking about changing people's attitudes, their behaviors, their engagement, and so on. So intrinsic motivation in that theory is historically talked about in terms of three kind of subcomponents. Somebody is said to be intrinsically motivated if they are competent, they feel a sense of competence about doing something. So you're competent in that particular subject matter. That's why you feel intrinsically motivated to study for the exam on that topic. Or relatedness is the idea that you relate to others in the same situation or boat. So the more you can relate to others, the more intrinsically motivated you are. Autonomy is the idea that you are the master of your own destiny, so to speak. You feel autonomous, that you can control it, that you feel like this is in your hands. And so this is not something that is dictated. So this is where it kind of differentiates from extrinsic motivation, right? So you feel autonomous, so you're the kind of the agent of change. So these are the three kind of fundamental foundation, so to speak, of intrinsic motivation according to self-determination theory. And so what we are proposing in this model is that we can try to alter each of these with different technological tools or technological affordances, the idea that I mentioned. So the affordance of navigability is an important one, which we'll talk about in great detail today. And so navigability and in general usability of a system is what we would improve in order to build competence. And the affordance of interactivity is what we would use to kind of build a sense of relatedness. And then we would use the concept of customization, or the affordance of customization, to build autonomy. So in a nutshell, this is really what the theory is trying to map each of the kind of the predictors of intrinsic motivation with specific affordances that are available and becoming increasingly available in increasingly sophisticated forms in these newer tools that I told you earlier about. So our basic propositions in this particular model is that these three affordances, or these three sets of affordances, through competence, relatedness, and autonomy, will impact intrinsic motivation, which then will create greater engagement with that health content, whatever that content is, and that greater engagement over time will eventually lead to changes in offline health behaviors. That's beyond what's there in the interface itself. So the propositions are basically optimal levels and not necessarily high levels of everyone. It could be, sometimes we've shown in our research that high interactivity is not necessarily a good thing. So it's the optimal level of interactivity, navigability, and customization could lead to intrinsic motivation via these psychological mechanisms of competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And that's the first part of this model. The second part, proposition 2, is that higher levels of intrinsic motivation will lead to levels of engagement with health technologies and their contents. And then the third proposition is the latter part, higher levels of engagement with those tools, and the content of those tools will result in more sustained use of those tools and then onto health behaviors. And so the latter part is really the domain of traditional health communication that you see in our field. The former part is really where this motivational technology model comes in. Yes?
So a quick question. When you say intrinsic motivation,
Mm-hmm.
can you say a little bit about, is that specific, so let's say we're talking about smoking cessation or a specific area, which I would imagine with any of these kinds of programs we would. Are we talking sort of specific to that area, or is this sort of some general? I'm curious about, I understand the definition of
Right.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
But in your model, would it
We would apply this specifically to,
or different, and would it be sort of examined specific to the health area that you're focusing on?
yeah, it would be specific to whatever health area that you would apply it to. So motivational technology model would be a model that you would use to design a particular tool for a particular activity. So right now we are collaborating with a group in Singapore where we are designing an iPhone app that does augmented reality, targeted at smokers who want to quit. So they're applying the motivational technology model to essentially hit at the competence, relatedness, and autonomy as it pertains to smoking, intrinsic motivation to kind of quit smoking. They are already kind of, they've signed on as quitters, but they've kind of succumbed to temptation every now and then. And so this tool is essentially using augmented reality technology in a theoretically governed way. That's what we are presenting here.
Interesting. And then a quick follow-up, if you don't mind. So, and then how is the attitudes variable you have, how is that different from, because like in the health literature, people sometimes conceptualize motivation as being attitudes or as being a part of it. But in your
Right.
model, you've got intrinsic, then you have attitudes being coming after that.
Right. So these are attitudes related to the outcome, downstream variable of behavior. So the motivation here is to use the tool, first of all, and then to stick with the tool. And that's where we come in as technologists. The attitude is about once you stick with the tool and once you kind of get into that mode, like many of us use the Nike application for jogging, for example, then you develop good attitudes toward jogging, toward maintaining good level of physical activity. And that attitude of course, that goes to theory of planned behavior and all those traditional models that talk about how attitudes are related to behaviors. Yeah. So like I said, that part is health communication domain. I'm not going to focus too much on that. That's the more traditional health communication, but I'm going to focus on the earlier part, which is really the innovation here, or which is hopefully something that is new to this audience, at least, the idea of using technological predictors of intrinsic motivation. So let me try to argue for you the three components. So the first argument that's being made is that navigability builds kind of a sense of competence. So if you look at this general notion of navigability, I mean, most tools these days are multi-layered, and people have to go through the tools in different ways, and different people navigate it in different ways. And so it's how you explore that tool, and it's highly idiosyncratic. Each person does it in their own way, but each person can also get stuck in many different ways, right? And that's really the frustration. If you see the person on the right, that's really what that person's going through. And this is a very common thing, right? This happens to us in our day-to-day experience with many tools. We don't know where it's heading, we don't know why we are clicking on this button, and so forth. So good navigability essentially is kind of complexity reduction. We need to reduce the complexity of undergoing the operations or going through the motions of that particular app by the careful use, clever use of scaffolds, what we call scaffolds. Scaffolds are these tools that help you kind of go through the system, okay? That help the novice user go through the system in a satisfactory way. And so we've done, several studies that talk about these issues of navigability. We've done studies on, virtual reality, where you go into a virtual environment, and how indeed if you design the virtual environment in certain ways, it can actually help you develop good spatial presence. And that's an important aspect. If you have to have a good sense of a psychological sense of what the presence of, the spatial presence of what the environment looks like, where things are. In fact, many of us have our mental maps of various sites that we go to, right? Banking site and stuff like that. We know which button's on the right-hand side, which is on the left, and so forth. We've done studies with customization, that in fact Sri's dissertation, which basically showed that when you customize something, the navigation behavior reduces. That is, we don't flail about so much because we know exactly what we're doing, because we've customized the environment to our own liking. So we don't keep returning to the front page, the main page, for orienting ourselves. For example, we've done studies on download speed, where we've shown that if you download slowly as opposed to fast toward a page, people are much more likely to kind of explore in an excited way and trying to find different things. So there are like arousal components to it as well. And then more recently, we've looked at issues related to cues on the interface, how certain cues can help you navigate. And this has become very common. As you see, news cues is a concept where we are talking about on news websites. You see these cues that say number of related articles, or how many people have kind of forwarded this, or how many people have shared this. All these are cues that tell you how important it is, and it gives you a navigability kind of signal saying this is where you need to go, kind of thing. So there are lots of these tools that we can build based on good kind of navigational sense, and some of it is based on creating an actual virtual space. That's the idea of spatial presence. Others are based on creating menu-based tools where you have a very good architecture, very good design sensibility that help you develop these cues. So some cues about what is elsewhere in the site, proximal cues about distal information, can give you a sense of information scent. This is a concept that people in information sciences use. It's the notion that you give people a scent of what lies ahead or where things are. That's an important aspect of cueing. Okay, so that's again a very important aspect of building decent navigation into a system. So I've been working with a model that Sri talked about in his introduction called the main model, where basically we conceptualize navigability and the other three affordances as well: modality, agency, and interactivity, as a set of cues. There are cues on the interface that produce these mental shortcuts. Okay, so and that mental shortcut is what determines our quality judgments and our credibility judgments, often without us even looking at the content. Many times we'll just say, hey, this has been forwarded 1,000 times. That's good enough for us to say this is an important story. We don't even read the story often. We'll just say if this is forwarded 1,000 times, then this must be important. So we are making a judgment of quality based on a cue, and the cue that triggers the heuristic, heuristic called bandwagon heuristic, which we'll talk about in a minute. So main model has a whole list of heuristics like this that we've lined up, and we study this in different ways. And as you'd see, the navigability aspect is at the very bottom, where we talk about information sent, and that can trigger a whole bunch of heuristics like the browsing heuristic or the elaboration heuristic or similarity heuristic, which is the idea that what I'm getting is similar to my interests. Play heuristics. There are some navigability designs where the idea is to play, have fun, and so that's also an important aspect of many interfaces, is to have this entertainment component. And so different heuristics are triggered by different cues that help you navigate through the system, and that's important for us to kind of keep in mind while designing these systems. So interface cues related to how many related articles or source credibility or how recently something was uploaded. These are topics that we've studied in our lab group and have been found to have very strong effects on how people navigate through a website, on a news website, for example. And these are critically determined. They explain a lot of the variance on what people select and what people don't select when it comes to selective exposure to online news, which is a necessity, as you know, because of information overload in online venues. So in general, good navigability and this idea of reducing complexity with scaffolds involves two kinds of scaffolds. There's on the one hand scaffolds related to navigational tools, and that's where you create these tools for them to get a good sense of spatial presence, like creating a virtual environment or trees and maps and menus on your website, which is the more conventional way to go about it. And then there's the idea of creating cues that potentially trigger heuristics about what might be worth pursuing for the user next step. Where should they go? What should they do? So these cues can come from any number of different ways. As you know, they're innovating on cues. You see every day new types of cues on your interfaces. Used to be just star ratings, then came the like button, and then there are all kinds of other kind of invitational kind of cues that you see on online sites as well as mobile applications. So these kinds of scaffolds are also important in addition to just menus and toolbars and so forth. So for a long, long time, the whole idea of human-computer interaction has been to increase usability, just make it more usable, just so that we can avoid this, right? And if somebody is sitting like this and looking at their site, chances are that they are frustrated, right? What do you think this person's going through? And what happens when you know how to navigate that site that person is watching? Or struggling with. Let's say this person is looking at the bank website, and this happens, right? Especially when you have an elderly parent who's trying to negotiate a particular online site that they have come to it first time, but you're used to it. You know where to hit the button for doing a transfer or which. So what do you do when you see this person like this in this state? You help them and you look for them. And then what happens when you help them out, when you're successfully helping this person out?
You become their savior or their crutch.
You become their crutch and savior. Okay. What do you feel psychologically when that happens? When you make that happen? You feel excellent. You feel competent. That's what I was going for, right? So this is the basic idea. I'm at a micro level. I'm primarily a psychologist, so I'm thinking about the level at which we are operating. You feel the sense of competence. This happens day in and day out, right? Where you scream at your parents saying you don't know anything. Essentially, what it means is you know how to navigate a stupid website. That's what you know, right? But you feel that sense of competence.
And is the gender specific there?
No. Well. Let me make it equal for you so that it's so Rhonda cannot complain. So all these people are highly motivated now by that website because they feel very competent at negotiating that website. And that's what we are trying to get at with interface design, is we want people to be able to navigate in such a way that at the end of it, that they feel competent, in the same way that you feel competent when you've shown somebody how to actually negotiate a site. And this is something that is at a fairly micro level, but can still be addressed with design. So these kinds of navigational tools that I've been talking about can increase the familiarity and predictability of the interface. There are studies that have shown that in the human-computer interaction literature. Information foraging theory talks about how information sent is a very important aspect of how people look for information, where they go. And in general, all these aids help usability, user-friendliness, and your control over that information, as well as your comprehension. So this is, in essence, the idea of navigability kind of building competence, and there are lots of features that are being innovated every day, but the basic idea is to build scaffolds that will help people move through the information in a way that is easy and usable, but also, like I'm suggesting based on main model, with some helpful cues that can make them feel that much more comfortable with that interface. The second part of this model has to do with interactivity. And interactivity, the argument here is that it builds relatedness, the second predictor of intrinsic motivation. Interactivity is the extent, at least it's defined here as the extent to which users can connect and have a reciprocal exchange with other people. So this is kind of like the person-person interactivity, if you will. So the degree to which you can have interactions with others and that they are reciprocated in ways. So I have been working on an interactivity effects model where we talk about interactivity not just as a medium feature. That's historically what everybody thinks when you say interactivity. They think of interactivity as this thing that all these newer toys have, right? Newer technologies have interactivity. They think, this technology can do this. On an iPad, you can swipe, whereas, on a regular phone, you couldn't do that. Those kinds of different features of the medium. But in my model, I try to encourage people to think about interactivity not just as a medium feature, but also as a source feature. I think of interactivity as the degree to which you yourself can become a source of content. And this is the notion of customization at one level, which we'll talk about as the next predictor of intrinsic motivation. But more pertinent to the interactivity as relatedness notion is to think about interactivity as a message feature. Here the goal is to think about interactivity as the ability of the interface to allow for this kind of reciprocal exchange in such a way that you get contingent responses. Contingency is kind of the key, which is the idea that whatever you get from the system is contingent upon what you put into the system. So the model that I have, has all these three kinds of interactivity leading to greater user engagement through different mechanisms. And that engagement, of course, has psychological outcomes. But for this particular argument that I'm talking about the last part, which is the message interactivity leading to contingency, which then creates greater user engagement. And this is what is relevant for this particular aspect of motivational technology model. So message interactivity is the degree to which you get an exclusive response to your input. And there's a bit of back and forth. There's a threadedness to this interaction. There's a contingency built into it. And this is a notion of interactivity that we've been working on for a very long time. But I'd like to share with you a study that just came out of my lab group. In fact, it's the dissertation of Bellur, who just graduated from our program. And so this is a project supported by NSF where we actually created an interactive system where people would go to the system and get a risk appraisal of their health. It's a risk appraisal system, which is very typical. You see lots of websites tell you how much you're at risk for this or that disease, right? So, in low interactivity version, they would go and the system would ask a question and then they would respond in some way. That would be the user response. And then the system would give a fairly generic kind of recommendation. That's the message recommendation. Then this is the norm, right? This is kind of how most of the risk appraisal systems that exist right now look like. Now, In the medium interactivity condition, if you follow my contingent interactivity model, you actually have to have some contingency, that the system tells you something based on what you said. So in the medium, we just built in an extra layer where the system would just repeat what you said, or at least acknowledge that you've said this before it gives you the recommendation. That was the only difference. In the high interactivity condition, we actually had it such that the system would take into account not only your most recent response, but also another previous response, kind of saying, okay, I know exactly where you've been in this thread, right? What is your kind of tree? And then that's where the contingency happens. The contingency is not simply reacting to what the user said, but reacting to what the user said before, and then the one message before, and then you collate that information saying, you also said that you tend to eat high-fat food, and putting that together with your exercise behavior, this is the recommendation kind of thing. So that's like the looping mechanism, so you have multiple. So when we did something like this, we show that the contingency that is perceived by the user is significantly higher when you have this kind of a system where the system gives you contingent responses, right? So message interactivity conceptualized this way leads to higher perceived contingency, which has all kinds of positive effects, all down to health behavior. We had questions relating to write down the questions you'll have for the doctor next time you visit them, and the significantly more number of questions that they wrote down if they had encountered that system with a high interactivity mode rather than a low interactivity, even though the content was identical across all conditions. You have to keep in mind that all these experiments, we keep the content identical. There's no new information being given just because it's high interactivity. It's the same information, but broken up in different ways. So it's purely a variation of the technological affordance rather than a content confound built into it. Question?
The nature of those kinds of comments that they write to ask the doctor, is it like, are they seeking loopholes or in their behavior or what?
Well, at the end of this particular study, at the end of this, they get a risk score, and they get some kind of information about where they are with regard to risk, and then they have to write a set of questions that they would take to the doctor about various things, like should I exercise more, or I have a family history of blood pressure. Is there something I can do now to kind of take care of that, and those kinds of issues. So there are all kinds of pertinent health issues.
Is that veritable feedback? So is that like a true score, the risk factor?
No. So we had to debrief at the end. We cannot have it as a true score, right? So there are all kinds of issues, but it is true in the sense that it is based on the scores of the whatever they said, whatever options they clicked. So it is true at that level, but it's not ultimately true. We are not going to give them very specific evidence. We also debrief them at the end, saying this is not really your true risk scores. You need to actually get it done through a risk appraisal.
What do you think is behind this? What are the psychological reactions, or what's happening? Because I'm not getting a lot of detailed information. I think the computer's paying attention to me. I think there's a little guy on the other end who's very knowledgeable and listening and giving me great advice, or it's affect. I feel better. I feel more confident using your other variable. Why are these great things happening on the end when nothing really happened?
Right.
I didn't get a lot of the detailed help.
So what's going on? There's a conversation that's going on, right? That's essentially what is happening. People feel that they are relating, or that they can relate to somebody, or that they're being related to. That's essentially what's going on. The same kind of standard, form letter, if you break it up such that it feels like it's being given to you in response to your previous input, contingent response, then people feel like, I'm being related to, and that's kind of the idea.
It's better information. Surely it's not just.
That's why we don't have content confound.
I want to.
Right. That's why we don't put content confound. Otherwise, it could be because it's better information.
So
right.
Now anything I use, I'm not going to be angry at it going in because I know it's just fooling me with these superficial changes.
They
It's
may
not really giving me good
not really necessarily true in the real world, but in my lab, in my experiments, when they go to my websites, that's true. So you can be angry at my websites, but I think WebMD will not try to fool you like that. I think they'll try to give you as much, if indeed they build that kind of contingent system, which they are still not quite ready yet. A lot of them are just doing this kind of a regular, generic recommendation message.
Want to teach these places, these sources of information, how to just fool people into thinking.
No. What we are trying to do is we are trying to tell them to build more contingent systems, right? Build more contingency into it so that they can respond to individuals in a way that makes more personal sense to them, that they can relate to them. That's the idea. But in order to demonstrate the value of that, we need to make sure that without content confounds, it has still happened, exactly. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some of these studies, which I was planning to talk about, but essentially the idea here is the same. We've kind of discussed that at some length about how indeed interactivity by way of building contingency can make people relate. And there are, again, different ways in which we can think about it. We can think about it as contingency back and forth. We can think about it as threadedness, and we could also think in terms of there being cues about relatedness. So some studies that we've done where this is very similar in spirit to the one that we just discussed, and this just came out in the Journal of Computer Mediated Communication, where we would go and this is somebody blogging, some subjects in our experiment. We told them that we'll introduce you to a new blog software. You can be up and blogging in 20 minutes. They would go home and blog, and then we overnight went to half the subjects' websites, blog sites, and then wrote a lot of comments. For the other half, we wrote very few comments, right? Again, the comments are not introducing new content. They're just reflective comments. I'm glad somebody said this, or it's great that this is up there, that kind of comments. So we found that those who got a lot of comments had a significantly higher sense of community, and then they felt a higher sense of influence as a result. They felt more empowered as a result. Another manipulation in that same study was site visits. Half the subjects we went overnight and kept hitting the refresh button to make it like thousands of people visited your site, but for the other half, very few people visited the site, right? We made that happen. Again, we manipulated that. Just the sheer metric of site visits, number of site visits at the end of the week, made them feel a greater sense of agency, that they are the kind of source of information, and therefore that also was predicted to,
Were all the comments of a positive,
generally supportive nature.
to your typical blogs
Right.
where people are saying
Exactly. That's a very good point. That's a very good point. That came up in the review cycle of that article, and we said that is indeed a limitation, because you do online encounter negative. But in this case, we were not really interested in the content of the comments, right? We were interested in the queue of how many comments there were. So here, keep in mind, the goal is what can we do to the interface features that can build relatedness. So one of the cues is have that interface feature that shows the number of comments more prominently. That's really what this line of research is arguing for, not so much how you should write your comments or what kind of comments you should encourage or discourage. Yes?
For those who didn't have very many comments,
Yeah.
was there actually a negative effect? I mean, was there a negative psychological effect? It's like, there were no likes.
Well, there could well be, right? Yeah. This happens, right? When you go on Facebook and you post something and you don't get that many likes, you feel terrible about it, depending on your level of what's your norm, right? Some people are I've heard people truly disappointed that their message that they thought was fun was not reacted to as widely as some other stupid message that they thought that was not worthy of all the attention. But yeah, that can definitely be a downside to that. But the upside to that is the fact that you have so much attention can make a difference to relatedness. And speaking of Facebook, we did presented a paper at AHA this year about news and how to get young people engaged with news. And we created this elaborate online experiment within Facebook with 17 different conditions. They would go and post a news story that they picked up from CNN on their wall, or send a direct message to their friend, or on the news feed, and then they would either have a question with it, or comment with it, or tag it and not tag it. So we had all these different factorial variations of this, 17 different conditions. But we found that for the most part, it was very hard to get people, young people, engaged with news. And the few predictors that we found were all related to the importance of self and how there's a relatedness between the self and the other. The four big predictors were location of posting. If you posted it on the wall, this is curious, isn't it? Actually, if I were to get your attention about a news event and I sent you a direct message, it's less effective than putting it up on the wall for you, because you want it to be publicly known and associated with that content before you pay attention to it. Being tagged is another way that again enhances your kind of reputation in your social network, right? Number of likes that you get, big predictor, as you can imagine. How many people like what you have posted, that makes a big difference to how engaged you are in that topic. And then favorability of comments. This is where it gets a little bit into the content as well. It's not like the previous study talked about number of comments. Here, how favorably they perceive. This is more like it's a self-report measure which predicted how engaged they felt. So this is not a technological manipulation as such like the others were. So in general, we found several studies, especially in the health domain. We did a study we designed an online health support system where people would go and engage with other people about health issues, and we gave them these little tags, authority cues as we call them, like online guru or member, different kinds of. But the more important thing is the thread rating. How helpful was the thread was rated by other people. Again, regardless of content, we either gave them like a 5-star or a 1-star rating for the thread helpfulness that they started, the question that they started, and number of people who ostensibly viewed their question. So again, like I described earlier, we would go overnight and change that, and some people get a lot of stars, some people get very few stars, and we basically had them look at how other people had rated or how many others had viewed this, and we found that itself had a significant effect on how empowered they felt, the sense of community they felt, which then translated toward the attitude toward posting as well as the intention to post in future. So it's not only helps them evaluate content in online communities, but also in terms of participating in online communities. That's a big problem. Health community boards, 95% of the people do not contribute anything. They're all what they call lurkers. They're just lurking. And so one of the issues that this addresses is indeed if you help them relate better to others and give them these cues of relatedness, like thread helpfulness ratings, the chances are it'll improve their participation in these online communities. So, you see lots of these applications like patientslikeme.com, and the power of community feedback is quite significant. I mean, bandwagon is one effect that we found very strong across the board. The bandwagon heuristic through many different ways, like star ratings and helpfulness ratings and so forth. So in this particular study, we found that the metrics need to be consistent, that if there's one message with a lot of views, it should also have a lot of likes, it should also have a lot of comments. If they are consistent, it helps than if they're kind of inconsistent kind of thing. And so in these different ways, through contingency or threadedness, like I talked about in the earlier study, or through bandwagon cues of other people kind of rallying around your particular content, these are two big ways in which interactivity tools on these online health applications can build a kind of sense of relatedness, and there are mechanisms underlying that, like a sense of community, for example, that I talked about in the context of our previous study. So, and then you can think of many different ways in which this is operationalized. I won't go into that. Let me just move to the third predictor, which is customization. And customization is a topic that I've been working with for several years now. In fact, one of the earliest studies was done with Shri for his dissertation about customization on websites. And since then, we've been working on several different ways in which we can tailor the mediated environment. And so basically, those of you who are in the health domain, customization is nothing but tailoring, except that tailoring is done by the user, not by the system. That's something that we call personalization. So here, the user tailoring aspect of it has many components. And one of the big components is this notion of filtering information. It's something that we all do online, that we have to do. We are kind of forced to do filtering, right? Because we need to kind of figure out what to consume. And then personal goal setting. That's something that is very common with iPhone apps and things like that, where you're setting your goals and kind of working toward it, and that's your specific goal. It's just for you, so it's a very personal kind of decision, but you are setting it yourself, so you're customizing it for yourself. So this is the idea of a customization, and studies have shown, including Sri's dissertation, that whenever something is kind of tailored to you and your interests, people have better attitudes toward that interface. And there are lots of different reasons for it. One of the big ones, of course, is perceived interactivity, the degree to which you feel that the system is interactive. And this is more of a perceptual variable, and the degree to which you feel the content is relevant or of utility to you, or more broadly, what we talk about as agency, is the degree to which you feel agentic. This is where we get to the second aspect of interactivity in that model that I referred earlier, which is the source interactivity leading to customization. And in general, we find that this kind of customization, the psychological mechanism, has to do with a kind of sense of agency. Just like in the previous one, it was more community and relatedness. This is more about personal or self-agency, the degree to which you feel like you can assert your influence, kind of thing. And again, we've done several studies on agency and how indeed we can feel much more agentic by customizing, and how indeed when you tailor information, you feel much more agentic than if the system tailors information for you. And I'll just preview that by showing you another model that specific to customization, which is the agency model of customization. Here, I define agency as the degree to which the self is the source of information, or source of action, or source of gatekeeping. Agency, some of you who might have read social psychological works on agency will know that people like Bandura talk about agency as volitional control. I talk about agency from a more media-centric perspective, which is the degree to which you are the source of content, and that source idea is broadly defined as either the creator, but more generally is just the content gatekeeper of information. And so if you think about customization versus personalization, which is the idea that the system tailors information for you, the agency model would predict that you would have better attitude towards the system with customization rather than personalization. If the system tailors it for you, then you're not going to be as positive toward that information as if you tailored it. That's customization, right? That's the prediction of self as source idea behind the agency model. And so we've done studies, for example, the study with Google News. They would come one day, read Google News, for a period of time. We would watch what they read. We would track what they read based on their interest. The next day they would come, and one group would get exactly what they had, all the topics that they had looked up. So if a subject had looked up spring break information, we would have an entire Google News segment on spring break. So next day when they came to the lab, they would get information that they are interested in. If somebody had read Harry Potter stories, they would get Harry Potter-based news from Google News. But for the other condition, so this is the personalization condition, where the system ostensibly delivers information based on what you have done before. But in the customization, the user gets to sit and do that customization. They decide which sections they want. They create their own news section, custom sections, and add that to Google News. And we found in this particular study that there was a moderator of power usage or technological savviness, the degree to which the user feels that they are savvy about the technology. And so we found transverse kind of interaction compared to control. Those in the customization condition were much happier with the quality of the content than those in the personalization condition, provided they were power users. So if you just look at the right-hand side of this graph, it looks something like this. The power users like it when they can customize rather than personalize. But the non-power users, you can see, is higher when the system personalizes information for them rather than they themselves kind of customize the information. And so, why is this going on? What could be some of the reasons? Is it the convenience aspect? It's generally speaking, People, especially non-power users, find it more convenient for the system to do all the hard work for them than they themselves. And the power users, could it be that they are actually more in, they want control? Another big concern is privacy. Increasingly, there's a lot of concern with online tracking. You might have read news stories this week about do not track function, and there was a big study out of Berkeley that the New York Times reported a couple of days ago about, they asked questions about if a do not track option were available to you when browsing the internet, which of the following would you most want it to do? And as much as 60% preferred that the websites don't even collect information about them. So the vast majority, there's this kind of mounting movement, I feel, toward not allowing systems to collect that information. So if that were to happen, and in fact all indicators are that it's going in that direction, the personalization push that you see in the engineering industry, in the health industry, where trying to give people what they think they want, is going to have to change, because people are not going to be happy with you having that personal information. And so they would much rather protect their privacy, and they would take the matters into their own hands. So anyway, we did a follow-up experiment where all we did is have a little manipulation that said the news website that you're about to browse may use your browsing information, and in the other condition we said will not share aggregated information. And we found that the transverse interaction that I shared with you earlier occurred only in the low privacy condition. So if you look at the right-hand side there, that's where you see that power users prefer customization over personalization, and non-power users prefer personalization over customization. That happens when there's low privacy, when they're told that the system will use information to provide them services and so forth. So it seems like, without being told, that's kind of the default assumption. And so in general, we find that this also is the case under low privacy with the perceptions of control and perceptions of convenience, whereas in high privacy, there's hardly any difference between personalization and customization. So if you protect their privacy, if you give them a safe space, like some of the online health community boards for specific diseases do, you give them the privacy and the boundaries, then there is a good possibility that personalization and customization work similarly, and it all depends on the power usage levels of the user. And so we've done a number of studies on this same issue, and we try to figure out what is it about customization that makes a difference to users. Why is it that they prefer customization, especially those who do, like the power users? Is it the sense of identity, or is it the sense of control that they get? And we find that both are significant for the most part. It's both a sense of identity and a sense of control. For non-power users especially, it's sense of identity, much more important. For power users, they derive their sense of identity from the sense of control that they have. So both of them are pertinent kind of variables. And so we've been designing widgets, like this is a diet widget where people can track their diet, their vegetable intake in this case, and they can actually input. And this kind of inputting and customizing it themselves has shown all kinds of nice effects on outcome variables related to health. But I'd like to briefly talk about identity, the power of identity, which is also one of the outcomes of customization. We did a study where people would go to a CDC island in Second Life, with a virtual environment that you might be familiar with, and they would get educated about health topics by a CDC agent, a virtual agent in Second Life. And we asked subjects in our study to create an avatar for themselves before they go, just like in any virtual game or virtual environment. The manipulation was whether they would be assigned an avatar by us or go in with a customized avatar. And we found that when they went in with a customized avatar, they were much more likely to translate that to self-preservation behavior offline. That is, they'd said that they would spend more time taking care of their health, or spend more time, in this case, of performing the exercise, advocated exercise behavior, and so forth. So just the nature of that the ego confusion, or the identity that you have with the avatar, and the avatar was kind of spoken with, made the difference. Sense of agency was the pertinent mediator, not sense of self-presence. A lot of researchers in our field have been talking about how avatars kind of create the self-presence, and that's the reason why people have an enjoyable time in online venues. While that is true for enjoyment, but for self-preservation and other health-related outcome variables, we find that sense of agency is very important. Sense of agency is something that we can imbue with customization, not just with pretty avatars, so to speak. So in general, the argument here is that once you let people customize, once you let people take control of their online environments, whether it's customizing your avatars or customizing your news menu or whatever it is that they're customizing, it builds a sense of autonomy. Just like we talked about earlier about usable systems building you a feeling of competence, you being able to do things, and technology allows us these days to do that, right? It actually makes people get more involved and have a higher sense of identity, greater control, which leads to heightened autonomy, and that's one of the predictors, as we know. And we have many different operationalizations of customizations, and so all of these three kind of legs of this model have implications for design of persuasive health technologies. We can design competence building tools with scaffolds and shortcuts, especially for power users. And we can build interactivity tools that go from kind of contingent message interactivity notions that we talked about earlier toward person interactivity, where there are affordances of sharing and getting people to give you comments and feedback, like in the form of cues like stars and other bandwagon indicators. And so we have all different ways in which we can mine these different ideas of interactivity and customization for health tools. And tailoring, like I just talked about, has many opportunities. I think it's effective in terms of giving people choices, especially user tailoring or customization, making them feel like they're the ones who are dictating or mastering their health universe. And in terms of user experience research itself, the research that is done to kind of figure out how users experience a particular interface, a lot of these give you metrics, right? So we can talk about competence metrics as the degree of control users feel, the quality of the information sent, the wayfinding ease, the usefulness of the guidance tools, or relatedness metrics could be the degree of contingency that there is in that system, or the degree of social and information feedback that you get from others in the system, degree of social presence in the system, social community, or the community